Welcome to the Philosophemes channel. In this seminar, we will discuss Roland Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author. I wanted to start off with this meme. Even modernism may be understood as better than postmodernism. So when we take a look at this meme, this idea of we are not interested in use value and exchange value, which at least are rooted in reality. In postmodernity, we are interested in sign value, which can be, of course, a product of the imagination. Okay, so I just want to clarify, I'm not interested in reading PowerPoint slides to you, but I think that having the PowerPoint slides present is helpful. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to put the key points on the PowerPoint slides and use them as prompts, if nothing else. But there are some quotes, for example, from passages that I do feel as though it's helpful for us to read together. It's just a part of it. If this were a classroom, you would have read those parts of the texts for homework, so I wouldn't have to read them to you. But this is the best way to do it, it seems to me. All right, I really enjoy this essay. I've taught this essay so many times throughout the years. I want to point out where to find it, talk about its length, its divisions, and really want to emphasize Barthes' disclaimer. This is so important. After all of this time that I've spent with this essay, I've finally come to realize that this might be the most important part of the essay now. And in the past, I downplayed this distinction and this disclaimer, but really, if we understand this disclaimer and this distinction, then there is a deep sense in which we can use it to help navigate postmodernity, help us navigate postmodern philosophy. I think that this disclaimer and this distinction cut directly to what it is that we are trying to understand, what it is that we're trying to debunk whenever we are encountered by postmodern philosophy. All right, then of course we're going to look at what Barthes refers to as the death of the author and the birth of the reader. We're also then going to look at the death of the author as it relates to postmodernism. We're going to look at the death of the author and hermeneutics, and the death of the author and history. Finally, then, we'll be criticizing the death of the author as a gaslighting technique, and we'll be criticizing showing the relationship between the death of the author and simulation theory, or what Jean Baudrillard referred to as the postmodern double. All right, so one of the things we want to recognize immediately is that this is a very short essay, and it's very easy to divide it into its 7 parts. Okay, so oddly enough, it's also chapter 7 of Image, Music, Text from Roland Barthes that was published in 1977. And when we look at this essay, we can see this essay is 7 pages long, and it's also 7 paragraphs in total. Its divisions then we can see are the opening paragraph, or section 1, a historical sketch from the modern author-centric approach to the postmodern language-centric approach. This points back to the meme that we started the seminar with as well. That would be sections 2 through 4 of this essay. For section 5 of this essay, we could title it Against the Metaphysics of Origin. And this is a theme that is prominent in Jacques Derrida's work as well. Section 6, we could say it's postmodern in general, but it's also especially prominent in Jacques Derrida's work. Section 6 is postmodern hermeneutics, or the so-called democratization of meaning. We could title section 7 From Author to Reader, From Origin to Destination, and the Myth of No Marginalized or No Lost Meanings in Literature. I think these titles are very important, by the way. These are not Barthes' titles. I created these titles to sort of paraphrase what's going on in each one of these sections. So those are the 7 sections of Barthes' essay. All right. So we're taking a look now at Barthes' disclaimer. And there's this entire seminar could be about this disclaimer. This disclaimer is so important for philosophy, and especially philosophy in relation to postmodernity. So notice you can see the image of Aristotle, and anytime that you see the word function, really it should make you think of Aristotle. I'm in the process of putting together many Aristotle talks, but at this point in time, let's just say Aristotle is in the background here. Aristotle and his idea of natural function, for example. Things are matter-form composites, and matter-form composites have natural functions as opposed to accidental functions. All right, or non-essential functions. All right, so according to Barthes, there are two types of fact narration. First, there's functional fact narration, and that's narrating a fact with regard to how that fact relates to reality, right? And non-functional, which is narrating a fact without regard to reality. Now, this disclaimer made by Barthes immediately after the opening paragraph of his essay seems to be universally overlooked, and that's highly problematic because I think this essay is so powerful for expressing postmodern ideas, but at the same time, it actually contains its own antidote. So here is a short excerpt from Barthes' essay. No doubt it has always been that way. As soon as a fact is narrated, no longer with a view to acting directly on reality, but intransitively, that is to say, finally outside of any function, other than that of the very practice of the symbol itself. So not use value, not exchange value, but sign value. This disconnection occurs. The voice loses its origin. The author enters into his own death. Writing begins. Now, that may sound lovely the way that this concludes, but we've got to make sure that we apply it appropriately. And so that's, we could say, a main theme of this seminar. Okay, so from the death of the author to the birth of the reader, this is an important point that comes out of Barthes' essay, and he stresses this. This is also known as the total relativization of meaning. And of course, that's in regard to literature. So this is ultimately where Barthes lands the essay, that postmodern literature, like Duchamp's ready-mades, and so that's the urinal, for example, that is considered postmodern art, depends on the reader, not the author of the literature, right? So when an observer considers the urinal a piece of art, then suddenly it, according to postmodernity, is an artwork. And if you're listening closely, you can hear something very important here. This is one of the reasons why in these political spheres, because what we're saying here is how the author considers themselves is not as important as how they are read by others. And so you can see how this sets people up in postmodernity to really try to enforce a kind of meaning making in regard to their own spectacle, which then, as we'll see later here, sets a person up to sort of create a simulation of themselves, their own double, as it were. All right. Classic criticism, we're reading Barthes here again. Classic criticism has never paid any attention to the reader. For it, the writer is the only person in literature. Notice literature. We are now beginning to let ourselves be fooled no longer by the arrogant, antiphrastical recriminations of good society in favor of the very thing it sets aside, ignores, smothers, or destroys. We know that to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. Again, that's the title of this essay, of course. Okay, so here is the opening paragraph of the essay. In his story, Sarrasine, Balzac, describing a castrato disguised as a woman, writes the following sentence. This was woman herself, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fussings, and her delicious sensibility. Now Barthes asks us, who is speaking thus? Is it the hero of the story, bent on remaining ignorant of the castrato hidden beneath the woman? Is it Balzac the individual, furnished by his personal experience with a philosophy of woman? Is it Balzac the author, professing literary ideas on femininity? Is it universal wisdom, romantic psychology? We shall never know, for the good reason that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing. All right, so I put some blurbs up here if you want to see the origin of this work of literature and the definition of the word castrato. Okay, so now we're taking a look here at the death of the author and postmodernism. And again, I'm hoping that you can see the, I'm not going to pursue every possible interpretation or practical application of these ideas, but I'm hoping that, some of these are pretty obvious to you. If you want to engage me in the comment section about this, I'd be happy to engage you about this. All right, so the death of the author and postmodernism. In terms of other postmodern theories, the death of the author aligns with the death of God and logocentrism. And at some point, as a philosophical idea, I will put together a video on philosophy's idea of the death of God, which we could say actually originates with Hegel. But in either case, we won't pursue that here. But you can see how this idea of the death of the author in general, insofar as we sometimes philosophically think of God as the author of everything, right, or God as the author of the universe, you can see how this postmodern idea of the death of the author analogously aligns itself with this idea of the death of God. And with the death of God, then this idea that our meaning making should no longer be logocentric. So you can see how all of this lines up, but what we must absolutely keep in mind is Barthes' disclaimer. So we're going to circle back around and conclude with that. In other words, here's another excerpt from Barthes' essay. We know now that a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, for example, but a multi-dimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. The text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture. The text. All right. Similarly, the modern theory of personhood is also drawn into a space of postmodern rewriting. For example, this idea that, well, who are you? What are you? What does it mean to be you? In short, how do you identify? If you think of that in terms of there was an author, for example, God, who created you, if the author is dead, then you must create yourself. You must create your own meaning, right? The problem with that, though, is that if you are the author of your own meaning, well, then the author is dead. So even if you want yourself to mean that within this context, it's questionable as to whether or not you mean that, right? With this shift from the death of the author to the birth of the reader. And so you can see how this becomes problematic in a postmodern space, because then we have to ask the question is that, well, how is it that others are identifying you? How is it that others are addressing you? How is it that others are reading you? And so we can see how this causes a lot of political strife in postmodernity. But again, this is the philosophy behind it. You can see the philosophy that makes sense of it. So next, these rewritings may be called the death of the author and hermeneutics, the death of the author and history. So we're going to take a look at these. The idea is supposed to be that because there is no one reading that determines the truth of meaning making, then we have to find some other way to ground meaning making or to ground meaning in postmodernity. So this idea regarding meaning making can be divided then into the making of meaning in general, hermeneutics, and how meaning has been historically made, or history. History can then be divided further into the history of how a meaning has been made, for example, the past, and how we make meaning regarding history, that is, the present. So when we're just looking at the past versus when we are in the present and making meaning presently about the past. So you could say that if we are not attempting to get the past historically in a historically accurate way, then there is a sense in which we are engaged in revising history. So this will make more sense as we go forward, but it's important to make that distinction, to recognize that there are actually two different ways that we can think about how meaning making relates to history. All right, so number 8 here, logocentrism or logotheocentrism or logophallocentrism are all labels that function in a twofold way. They identify modern centrist thinking, that is, meaning revolves around something that confirms its truth, right? And they identify what that something is, whether it's patriarchy, religion, reason, science, and so on. All right. Postmodern literary theory, then, uses a writing-centric vocabulary. If we think about final vocabularies and the play of vocabularies in postmodernity, postmodern literary theory uses a writing-centric vocabulary to re-account for hermeneutics and history in light of the death of the author. This is why we hear the word subject used in place of the word person. So instead of being a sovereign person, you are a subject to the other, right? You can see this. These postmodern ideas, if you've been watching the episodes and seminars recently, these postmodern ideas are just sort of dancing across all of those episodes and seminars. I continually hear the overtones and the echoes across all of these different presentations. So persons have rights and an identity constituted and safeguarded by some ultimate truth. For example, God, the Constitution, patriarchy, reason, science, and so on. From here emerges the idea that something is a performance, right? So if it's no longer the case that the identity is safeguarded by the creator or safeguarded by some objective, for example, or metaphysically real or just real being, then suddenly it becomes the case that how one is being is a kind of performance to be judged by the reader, right? And that because this is no longer author-centric, but rather reader-centric, that the meaning then derives from how the public or how the polis determines or reads the performance. Again, the meme at the beginning, it's not about mind external reality, it's not about engagement with reality as much as it's about sign value. It's about performing signs. From here emerges the idea that something is a performance. Language knows a subject, I'm reading Barthes' essay to you, not a person. And this subject, empty outside the very enunciation which defines it, suffices to make language hold together. Suffices, that is to say, to exhaust it. So there is no need to refer back outside of the performance to natural function, for example, to refer outside of the performance to the author's intention or to, for example, God. Rather, the performance itself, the performance is sufficient unto itself in terms of its meaning. All right. Rather, it designates exactly what linguists, referring to Oxford philosophy, call a performative, a rare verbal form exclusively given in the first person and in the present tense, in which the enunciation has no other content. It contains no other proposition than the act by which it is uttered. So, in other words, the performance of enunciating, writing language is itself sufficient to account for and constitute the subject who speaks. Yeah. Of course, this is going to be in regard to an other, in regard to a reader, right? Barthes said it exhausts it, meaning that no further theory is needed to determine the meaning of the author of the statement, right? This is the postmodern self, also known as the postmodern subject effect. Okay, so we're entering into our critical phase of the seminar then here, this presentation. So surely Roland Barthes is a genius, right? He looks like a movie star to me. And clearly this kind of thinking can be used to undermine pretty much all modern interpretations of art and literature, right? You can say, well, anytime anyone wants to invoke the author or the creator of the work of art, you can undercut it with postmodern theory here. What is more, many leftist ideologies deploy this death of the author postmodern style of critique or critical theory, for example, the denial of logocentric race or gender. However, there is one key part that we must not forget regarding this idea, and that is Barthes' disclaimer. And that is the distinction between functional and non-functional. Namely, the death of the author pertains to literature, not to reality. So as long as we are talking about literature, as long as we are talking about meaning making as it relates to art and literature, and I understand that metaphysically we can sometimes say that life is a work of art, or that this person is themselves a work of art. We can consider the person from the point of view of aesthetics. We can consider the person from the point of view of poetry or poetic dwelling, and we can consider this person a work of art. At the same time, we don't want to use this metaphorical characterization or this metaphorical understanding to undermine the distinction between, for example, reality and literature. It seems to me that Roland Barthes' interest was to, and of course you could say, well, it doesn't matter what his interest is because he's the author of this essay and the author is dead. But it does seem as though his intention was to reopen interpretive space for literature, to reopen interpretive space for art, and that this has been weaponized politically to suggest that we no longer need to concern ourselves with mind external reality. We can just be surrealist or Hegelian all the way down, and we don't need to concern ourselves with things like use value and exchange value. We only need to concern ourselves with sign value, with spectacle, performance, simulation. To focus in a little bit more on Barthes' disclaimer here as we round this out then. So according to Barthes' disclaimer, there are two types of fact narration. There's the functional, narrating a fact with regard to how that fact relates to reality, and there's the non-functional, the narrating a fact without regard to reality. So to ignore this distinction and to ignore this disclaimer is to affirm a nihilism that ultimately consumes even the death of the author with its nothingness. We can undermine essentially any meaning, including this idea of the birth of the reader, if we really wanted to, if there's just nothing to ground our meaning making in, or nothing to ground our meaning making on. Okay, so the death of the author as a gaslighting technique. We'll see how ignoring that disclaimer allows for this. Ultimately, the nihilistic, non-disclaimer avowing understanding of the postmodern death of the author style of critique, critical theory, can be used as a gaslighting technique by suggesting to people who have not read Barthes that the author is dead, that's logocentric, and so on. Speakers are able to get their listeners to question the meaning they made regarding reality. So that seems pretty straightforward. That's how it can be a gaslighting technique. However, you say, well, I know the author, I read some secondary source that said the author intended to mean this. This is what Balzac meant when he was talking about the castrato. You can undermine that by saying, yeah, well, but the author is dead, right? So it can be used as a gaslighting technique. So even though you think it means that and you have good reason to think it means that, we can still call it into question by saying, well, but the author's interpretation no longer trumps the reader's interpretation. So, however, the death of the author is only a gaslighting technique when taken out of the context of literary criticism, because within the context of literary criticism, you could say, well, yes, but there are many different ways to read this text, despite the author's intention. So one of the common outcomes of the political employment of the nihilistic, disclaimer-denying reading of the death of the author is the belief that demarginalization is closer to justice than is merit, for example. You could say something like demarginalization is a kind of sign value, whereas merit refers to use value and exchange value. So in order to maintain a reality-based boundary in the face of such gaslighting, simply recall, so this is the antidote, simply recall Barthes' disclaimer regarding two types of fact narration, functional and non-functional. The death of the author only works regarding the non-functional, that is, narration of facts as they are found in art and literature. Okay. The death of the author and simulation theory, the postmodern double, so that we're concluding this now. So classic criticism has never paid any attention to the reader. We saw that earlier. For it, the writer is the only person in literature. We know that to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. Now, the reader is the space on which all the quotations that make up a writing are inscribed without any of them being lost. So you can see this, nothing is marginalized anymore. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. The origin is the author, the destination is the reader. Yet this destination cannot any longer be personal. So Barthes here is saying it himself. The reader is without history. The reader is without history. Biography, psychology. He is simply, right, one would argue that it should say she or they today, but he is simply that someone who holds together in a single field all the traces by which the written text is constituted. Right? So in a sense, you could say that the text, the literary text, is itself a kind of performance, and that the performance manifests in the spectator. The performance manifests in the audience. It manifests in the reader. So in this way, even though he's suggesting that it's no longer personal, you could say that the reader brings to the text a kind of history that brings the performance of the literature into play. So it's not simply that what the author constructed is in play, but what the author constructed is in play with what the reader brings to the text. Okay. So lastly then, notice the nihilistic disclaimer denying reading of the death of the author suggests one is merely a performance, not an actual person, that you are just a performance. And so it's fascinating. It's really fascinating to think about this in the context of transhumanism. And one of the reasons it's so fascinating to think about this in the context of transhumanism, in my opinion, is because we can see how there's a clear shift to this idea of how the other thinks of me in some way constitutes my meaning in postmodernity, right? The reader is more important than the author. The reader is more important than the creator. So what that does is it undermines the idea of the content creator, or undermines the idea of the person in transhumanism. It undermines the idea of the person and suggests that the person is a kind of performance. So you could see how that it would be important to enforce or impose rules upon the audience, preemptive rules upon the audience, to get the audience to determine the meaning of your performance based on how you intend your performance to be understood, how you intend for it to be read. However, that move is actually a reversion back to the intention of the author, right? So it's interesting. It seems like if you're going to go full on postmodern, you have to be willing, if you're going to go into a space of sign value, you have to be willing to let art be art, right? You have to be willing to put together a performance and let it play, right? And it's going to enter into critical spheres, and it's going to enter into congratulatory and celebratory spheres. But to attempt to control it, we could say, is not really in the spirit of postmodernity. So you could say, even though it's important how the author intends for the work of art to be identified, if we are going full postmodern, we must abandon the intention of the author. We must abandon the intention of the author of that performance, right? Because the author is dead, and the reader is the space from which meaning emerges. So notice that this opens the door in postmodernity to what Jean Baudrillard, and I've got some really exciting things planned for Baudrillard, by the way, so stick around for that in another episode or seminar, of course. But this opens the door for what Baudrillard referred to, or has called, the postmodern double. There's so much that we could say about the postmodern double, but it's important here to just kind of sketch, or to show you how these ideas connect with one another. So what this is, and what is this, and how does it happen? So the postmodern double refers to the performative identity that postmodern actors seek to sustain. Okay, whoever is giving the performance, we might say, if you don't like the word actor. It is rooted in a style of meaning-making that is based solely in non-functional fact narration, right? If you think back to the Richard Rorty episodes, we're not interested in getting reality right. I mean, this is postmodernity all the way down. It's Hegel, it's Lacan, it's everything that we've been looking at recently here. So since it is a style of meaning-making that is not interested in reality, it's not interested in function, or what Aristotle would call natural function, whether this be the natural function of genitals, whether it be the natural function of the body, whatever natural function is we're talking about. This literary theory is not interested in grounding meaning making in function. All right. So while ultimately denying the disclaimer and distinction between functional and non-functional fact narration, so it's often the case, it seems to me, that postmodern theorists and those who embrace postmodern theory, on the one hand, we can see that they embrace it inconsistently, but because they also don't recognize that they themselves are subject to the death of the author whenever they are trying to enforce the reader to read in according with their intention. But it's also the case that they seem to completely deny that there even is such a thing as the narration of function, or the narration of functional facts. So there are multiple strategies for denying the disclaimer and distinction. Yet with this insight, you need not look for a corner in a round room by chasing down all the attacks on logocentrism. The postmodern double is a literary creation, right? This social self, this cybernetic self, this postmodern self that is projected into cyberspace, that all of those things, right? That it is a literary creation. It is a kind of performance. It is not real in the sense that we are ignoring its functions. So long as we are ignoring its functions, we're ignoring its use value and its exchange value, we're only concerned with it in terms of its sign value, then we could say that we're not considering it as something that's real. And again, this perfectly lines up with the Richard Rorty episodes from 2 and 3 weeks ago. So it functions as a kind of simulation then, right? For example, this is the distinction between pretending and simulating. So the idea is something like with Baudrillard, that when you pretend, for example, he uses the example of calling in sick for work, or calling out sick for work, as they say out here in the West, that there's a distinction between pretending and simulating. When you pretend that you are sick, you call in and you say, I'm sick, I'm not coming to work, but you're fine. You're just pretending to be sick whenever you're talking to your employer on the phone. But when you simulate an illness, according to Baudrillard, you actually take on some of the symptoms of the illness that you're simulating. So you could see here that if we pull all of this together, we could say that the postmodern self, beyond the spectacle, for example, that the postmodern self is hyper-real, that the postmodern self is a kind of simulation, and that the person who is performing this simulation actually takes on some of the characteristics of what it is that they are attempting to perform. Whether we call this psychosomatic in a modernist context, in the postmodern context, we would say that this is indicative of the distinction between simulating and pretending. Again, I think that the two key pieces here is that we must keep in mind that the postmodern self, if we are truly trying to deny reality, that the postmodern self then also is not concerned with the intentions of the author of that performance. That's super important. I think that that's just lost on all these postmodern theorists. I think they're completely overlooking it. And I think that ultimately it comes down to this other idea, which is that Barthes' disclaimer is so radically important. It is the very idea upon which this death of the author theory is founded, and yet it seems as though postmodern theorists throw it out the window. They've forgotten about this. And that's one of the reasons why postmodern theory is so problematic. So the concluding thought here, Barthes' postmodern idea of the death of the author is supposed to allow for the previously marginalized styles of reading, art, and literature to enter fully into the play of interpretation. And I think that it does that. That is correct. And that allows for a more robust meaning making in regard to literature. I would encounter this all the time at some of the different colleges and universities where I was teaching. You'd go into one of these classrooms, and I would be talking with my students, and any text would come up, right? So we're talking about something written by Mark Twain. And they would say, yeah, really, we realize that text is just transcoded, right? Or really, that text is about homosexuality. We encountered a manual for installing VCRs or operating a VCR, and we realized that manual for operating a VCR is actually transcoded, that really the booklet here that describes how to use the VCR, you don't even know what a VCR is probably, right? But the booklet here that describes how to use this DVD player or how to log into your streaming account, we've realized that this text is actually transcoded. So you can see that certainly if we're talking about literature, there is some sense in which, sky's the limit. We can interpret this any way we want to interpret it. And that's why it on some level, it kind of makes sense that it's like, well, hey, we see a pronoun here, so what's being suggested? How does this relate to the history of oppression and things like that, right? That makes sense. It also makes sense when you're in a purely literary sphere. For example, if we're talking about function takes time, or function is time limited in a sense. And so we can't stand around, for example, if we only have so much time before this window closes, we can't stand around and have a conversation about, the history of oppression and why you should use that 3-letter word instead of that 3-letter word, whenever the 3-letter word that we're using is really only in passing here as a kind of sign to help facilitate the use or the function of what it is that we're doing, the use and the function of the event, as opposed to just embracing signs as if we're in a sphere of signs only, a sphere in which there are only signs at play. So I'm hoping that makes sense. Certainly it allows for the queering of texts and so on, right? And I mean, all of that makes sense. It all makes sense. Barthes himself is saying this, right? What is the meaning of the story that is suggesting that the castrato was woman herself? What is the meaning of that statement? However, if we disregard or deny Barthes' disclaimer regarding reality, then we risk operating tyrannically. And I think that this is the ultimate soteriological, ultimate ethical point that we can draw from out of all of this ontology and criteriology. So while using a literary theory to justify ourselves in a non-academic, non-literary context, it becomes possible for us to become tyrannical. Being tyrannical is, of course, a vice. It manifests its own punishment. Not only does it cause problems elsewhere as well, but it does manifest its own punishment. And everything I'm saying right now is coming from Plato. And it incites violence, not peace. For example, being brown or black or white or queer does not necessitate being tyrannical. Being tyrannical is still a choice. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you can see how this connects with all of the other seminars and episodes that we've recently been putting together here. It seems like we're on a postmodern run right now. I really enjoy the Roland Barthes essay. I think it's a great piece of philosophy. We must keep in mind his disclaimer that there is a distinction to be made between functional and non-functional narration of facts, and that literary interpretation can do away with the functional narration of facts, or the narration of functional facts can do away with it, but in reality, or in the way that we interact with each other, we cannot do away with use value and exchange value. We cannot do away with it for the sake of merely sign value. So therefore, we must keep in mind function when we narrate facts that relate to reality.